Welcome to Magic's most disliked decks, cards, and strategies. This video will focus on the decks, cards, and strategies that tend to be the most disliked amongst the Magic playing community and examine why that is. Observant viewers will note the why right away, though I'll provide more details later in the video. It should be noted that there's a wide array of opinions and not everyone thinks the same way and has different preferences, but there are common sentiments, often from a majority of players or substantively large segments of the player base. This isn't objective, but rather what I've observed from many years playing the game, viewing matches, and speaking with other players. Before diagnosing the disease, let's look at the symptoms. Counterspell control. These decks seek to control their opponent's threats primarily with counterspells, although they're supplemented with regular removal and sweepers, slowing the game down, utilizing card draw to refill on answers, and eventually landing a game-winning threat that often is also the source of card draw. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, is emblematic of these strategies, but any similar cards such as Jace the Mind Sculptor and Legacy can substitute. These decks tend to be disliked the most by more casual players, that is, players who only attend weekly events like FNMs or play the arena ladder, whereas more competitive players tend not to have the same animosity. It's important to note that there's a psychological difference between getting your cards countered versus hit by other forms of removal. Although there are cards like Planeswalkers or permanents with ETB triggers that accrue immediate value if not countered, even though, practically speaking, there's no difference between whether your Tarmogoyf is hit by Counterspell or Terminate, there's something about it that's more psychologically disheartening. Control decks also often have the problem that they establish a superior position of board presence and card advantage, but technically don't win the game until many turns later, forcing the opponent to either concede or play a long, boring, drawn-out game on the slim 1% chance they can make a comeback. A variant of this gameplay pattern is what I'll dub the Counterspell Curiosity decks. These are blue aggro decks like Spirits and Pioneer, where the game plan is to land an evasive creature on turn 1 and then suit it up with a curiosity effect like Curious Obsession. They then counter everything relevant their opponent plays for the rest of the game and never run out of counterspells since they're attacking and drawing an extra card each turn. Next are black decks that rely on early hand disruption like Thoughtseize or Grief. These strategies are exemplified by decks like traditional Jund, Rakdos Scam, and Death Shadow. There are many synergy-based decks that rely on assembling either a critical mass of resources or combining specific cards to achieve a greater outcome, both of which are severely stymied by a turn 1 Thoughtseize. This often results in a player keeping an otherwise solid opening hand and instead being knocked out of the game from the word go. It's especially frustrating when you're hit by 2 Thoughtseizes back-to-back, where you might have been able to recover after the first one, but the second one completely blows you out of the game. Early hand disruption is also particularly punishing for mulligans where the player is already down 1 or more cards. Next are fast aggro and combo decks. These are decks that quickly and consistently win by at least turn 3 and sometimes earlier. They're often frustrating to play against because they can win the game so quickly, either before the opponent has time to assemble a board presence, find answers, or otherwise execute their game plan. Some examples of these types of decks are Greasefang or Neoform Atraxa in Pioneer, Creativity or Burn in Modern, and Sneak and Show or Reanimator in Legacy. A general rule of thumb is that the harder it is to interact with the deck, the more disliked it is. For example, stack-based combo decks like Lotus Field or unorthodox strategies such as Dredge that aren't affected by typical mainboard creature removal. Next are stacks or prison decks that lock the opponent out of playing the game, often through mana denial. The exact lock pieces differ, but some example cards are Blood Moon, Back to Basics, or Looping Wasteland with Life from the Loam. And some example decks are things like Mono Red Prison, Ponza, and Death and Taxes. However, while these decks are often built around mana denial, they aren't limited to only that and can win in other ways, such as locking the opponent out with prison combos like 3 Fairy plus Possibility Storm. Prison strategies are the best example of where majority preferences trump the minority ones. Wizards typically doesn't print cards like Stasis anymore and costs land destruction spells at no cheaper than 4 mana because they know the majority of players don't like mana denial. Next are ramp decks that accelerate their mana production far ahead of schedule, being able to cast spells that cost upwards of 6 mana by turn 3 or earlier. Examples are decks like Amulet Titan, Scape Shift, and especially Tron. Similar to fast aggro and combo decks, these can be frustrating because opposing decks that don't ramp are often at a disadvantage due to their cheaper spells not being able to compete with the value of the ramp deck's more expensive ones. And speaking of not being able to compete with value, another style of deck that breeds similar distaste are the go over the top or all value decks. There are many decks like this, but the best example is Modern Elementals. These are decks where most, if not every card in the deck draws 1 or more additional cards or otherwise provides value in some way. Both ramp and value decks can be frustrating for players who run mid-range or control decks who want to play a quote-unquote fair game because it feels like their opponent has a never-ending supply of must-answer threats and unlimited card advantage. Next up is tempo, exemplified by decks like Murktide, Delver, and Rhinos. These are also fast decks, but in a different way than what we've been discussing up to now. Rather than outright winning the game in the early turns, they apply too much pressure too quickly while also having disruption to slow down the opponent. An example would be playing a turn 1 Ragavan and then having Spell Pierce or Counterspell backup to protect it, or cascading into 8 power of Rhinos plus 2 more if you have Shardless Agent on turn 3. Last isn't a specific deck, card, or strategy, but rather when something becomes disliked due to ubiquity or time, what I'll call the Siege Rhino effect. This is when something becomes too powerful and ubiquitous in a format, showing up either in too great a number or for too long. As an example, let me take you back to 2014-2015 Khans of Tarkir Standard. Siege Rhino is printed and quickly becomes one of the format's best cards, making Abzan mid-range decks that contain it omnipresent for the entire duration of that standard. And if this is a little too abstract for you because you never played against Siege Rhino, it was too long ago, or because it's been power crept so much since then, let's compare it to Sheoldred. They're both 4 mana creatures in black that are both 4/5s, both gain life, and both drain the opponent's life. They're solid mid-range threats that put pressure on the opponent and make it hard for aggro decks to race them, acting either as mid-range cappers or a bridge to more expensive and powerful spells. So, flashing back to Khan Standard, Siege Rhino was a powerful card, but it wasn't too powerful. It was good, but it wasn't on the same ban-worthy power level as a creature like, say, Uro. Rather, the dislike for it stemmed from how ubiquitous it was. It was a fixture in the format for the entire time it was legal, and Abzan decks with it came to be disliked essentially for being boring and stale after sticking around for so long. This is something that can happen to any format, where even things that are exciting and interesting at first eventually become stale after enough time passes without something changing. The converse of this principle also applies, where a deck that would otherwise be loathed isn't because of its scarcity. For example, Neobrand in Modern is a combo deck built around cheating out an early Gristlebrand and then drawing an obscene amount of cards to eventually assemble a win, and it can do this as early as turn 1. But Neobrand is also incredibly inconsistent and fragile, basically losing to a single piece of interaction like one counterspell. Therefore, the deck isn't played much, which naturally leads to less animosity towards it than would otherwise be expected. This principle also applies to how metagames determine the makeup of sideboards. For example, if there are multiple top-tier graveyard-based decks in a format, players are naturally going to put graveyard hate in their sideboards, making games against those decks more manageable. However, if there's a lack of graveyard-based decks, players will shave on graveyard hate in their sideboards or remove it entirely. Then, a graveyard-based deck like Dredge becomes well-positioned because no one's prepared to fight it, which leads to players putting graveyard hate back in their sideboards, and so on. The cyclical rise and fall of Dredge in Legacy was a tradition. It should also be noted that dislikability is affected by what you choose to play and how that affects your good and bad matchups. To reiterate what I said before, players on Jund are going to look a lot more disfavorably on Tron, which is a difficult matchup for them, as opposed to those on Ponza, who can easily destroy Tron's lands before they get going. So, now that we've been incredibly brief and concise about all of this, why are radically different decks, cards, and strategies disliked? Why do some players dislike Tron while others despise Elementals, 2 very different decks? What do these decks have in common? Well, the common thread is that they create a lack of player agency. This can be summed up by the thought you've had when playing certain matches of, I can't do anything. It's the same feeling you have when you get mana screwed or flooded, the thought that your decisions don't matter and there's nothing you can do to win, that you're playing a non-game, or that rather than a demonstration of skill, the game has become a slot machine. Now, any collectible card game, Magic included, has variants built into it. What's in your opening hand and what's in your opponent's? Who's on the play and draw? What cards do you draw? How do they line up against your opponent's cards? For that matter, what deck did you choose before you even arrived at the tournament, and does it have good or bad matchups against your opponent's decks? These are natural elements of a card game that keep it dynamic and fresh. The problem comes when things are too lopsided, too random, and too out of your control. This is usually caused either by specific decks, cards, or strategies being too powerful and dominant, which sometimes leads to bannings, or it's caused by a lack of good interaction. Let's talk about fair versus unfair. Magic decks are often separated into 2 categories by players, fair and unfair. What does this mean? Well, there's no exact criteria for what makes a deck fair or unfair, but there are guidelines. Playing on curve is fair, meaning you only get 1 land drop per turn. Maybe your deck runs mana dorks, but it's generally not more than one turn ahead of your opponent in terms of its mana production, whereas dedicated ramp decks that accelerate on mana like Tron, Scapeshift, or Amulet Titan would be considered unfair, paying the normal full costs of spells versus cheating on their costs. Decks like Reanimator, Creativity, or Show and Tell that cheat threats into play, threats that cost a lot more than what was actually paid for them, are considered unfair. Grindy, value-oriented decks that are focused on attacking and blocking with creatures, casting removal spells, and fighting over board position and card advantage. These are decks like Classic Jund and are considered fair. The converse are decks that are hard to interact with or use unorthodox strategies like Dredge or Mill. Does the deck contain a game-winning combo, assembling 2 or more cards that create an infinite loop or lock the opponent out of the game? And can it assemble this combo without any prior setup on the board? It also matters how fast it is and how difficult it is to disrupt. Having these criteria often means players consider the deck to be unfair. Now, it's important to note that a deck isn't considered fair or unfair just because it has one or more of these elements. Rather, it's a spectrum and a matter of degrees of each one. Let's do a thought exercise. Is Yawgmoth in Modern fair or unfair? It has a game-winning pseudo-infinite combo that can win out of nowhere, including at instant speed with Chord of Calling. It cheats creatures into play with Eldritch Evolution. It accelerates its mana with various dorks and Wall of Roots. And even setting the combo aside, Yawgmoth himself can just draw a ton of cards. The deck is also fairly consistent with 8 tutors. But on the other hand, the combo requires assembling 3 to 4 specific creatures and can be disrupted by many instant speed removal spells or graveyard hate. The actual card quality in the deck is pretty bad. Yawgmoth, Grist, and the tutors that find them are good, but all the other creatures have subpar stats or are mana dorks. And lastly, even with mana dorks accelerating the deck, it's usually not more than 1 or 2 mana ahead, a far cry from the obscene output of decks like Tron and Amulet Titan. So is Yawgmoth fair or unfair? Ultimately, unfair is often just synonymous for a deck I don't like. Bad play patterns are worse than broken cards. Broken things like Hogak or Eldrazi Winter receive the bulk of players' negative attention, but I'd argue that less powerful cards that go under the radar that aren't ban-worthy but create unfun play patterns are far worse. To illustrate my thesis, let's look at Hogak versus Teferi Time Raveler. Hogak was a broken AF card printed in the first Modern Horizons set. It created a Dredge-esque graveyard-based aggro combo deck that was extremely powerful, often winning by turn 2 or 3, and was somehow fairly resilient to graveyard hate. It became utterly dominant during its time in Modern and eventually had to be banned. As a personal anecdote to illustrate how absurd it was, I attended Grand Prix Vegas in 2019 and Hogak was everywhere at all the top tables and scoring most of the top finishes. And yet, because everyone knew how absurd the card was and that it was definitely going to be banned, vendors were only offering $3 to $4 for it. So now let's turn it over to Teferi Time Raveler. Teferi, as it's sometimes called, is a very powerful card, disrupting most decks with its bounce ability and its anti-instant speed static ability, turning the match into one-sided Hearthstone for the opponent. An unanswered Teferi nearly always makes the game less fun to play for the other player, especially if they're relying on counterspells or other forms of instant speed interaction. Incidentally, Teferi also shuts off numerous random cards like suspend spells, for example, which I imagine was probably overlooked by the designers. So if Hogak is so broken and it had to be banned, but Teferi is merely annoying, why do I say that Teferi is worse? Because while cards like Hogak ruin a format for a few months until they're banned, cards like Teferi worsen a format forever. Teferi is good in Modern and Legacy, but not too good. It'll probably never be banned, nor do I think it's worthy of being banned. It'll just continue to exist, forever an annoying pest you want to swat away whenever it shows up. So, what is good gameplay? Well, again, everyone's going to have their different opinions, but to me, the best form of gameplay in Magic is Jund mirrors, and I'm not really even a fan of Jund myself. Jund mirrors have a very nice back and forth, grindy, attrition, card advantage based gameplay. There's lots of decisions to be made which do matter, and player skill is highlighted a lot more than variance. Additionally, Jund mirrors have lots of opportunities that are good for making a comeback, even in situations where it looks like one player is dominating. For example, imagine both Jund players are empty-handed, but one of them controls a Liliana of the Veil and a Tarmogoyf. Initially, it doesn't seem like the other player has much of a chance, but then they top deck Bloodbraid Elf, Cascade into a removal spell which kills Tarmogoyf, and immediately attack Liliana, putting them in a superior position. This is the kind of gameplay that I think is the best form of playing Magic. Conversely, the worst form is things like Tron mirrors. Tron mirrors are basically entirely play draw dependent, where the player who's on the play gets to assemble Tron first, and then when they play either Karn, pick off their opponent's lands, shutting them out of the match. Basically, decisions, interaction, back and forth, and the ability to make a comeback from a losing position are better than games where it's high variance. What's an ideal format? Now that I've talked about all these things and why they're bad, what are some good things? What attributes make a format fun and desirable? Deck diversity. It's boring to play against the same decks over and over again, nor is it fun to choose a deck to play if your options for what's competitively viable are too low. Ideally, you want every deck to be viable, but that's unrealistic. Practically speaking, a good baseline number is 8, enough for an all completely unique lists in a top 8 cut, and the more beyond 8 the better. More specifically, you want diversity not just of decks, but of archetypes and play patterns. It doesn't matter if your format has 20 viable decks if they're all combo decks or they're all black mid-range decks that basically play the same. Additionally, decks should be roughly equal in their viability and representation, with no deck being overrepresented or clearly considered the best deck, something that's historically been a problem in Legacy due to Delver. Ideally, you want all decks to have equal matchup spreads, but realistically, every format will have some form of a rock, paper, scissors metagame where decks have good and bad matchups. The main thing you want here is that no matchup should be too lopsided, and sideboarding can be used to alleviate this. A good format should ideally have room to brew new decks, with players able to explore new ideas enabled by a large card pool. And lastly, and this is the important point, a good format needs fun play patterns. All of the previous criteria can be met, but if the format isn't fun, then none of that matters. To illustrate a bad format, let's look at combo-centric Pioneer. Pioneer used to be a format with only 4 viable decks: Inverter Oracle combo, Heliod Ballista combo, Underworld Breach combo, and Kethis combo. It was a stagnant, terrible format with low deck and archetype diversity, all 4 of the viable decks being combo decks with play patterns most players don't like. It got so bad that at one point, Pioneer events couldn't even get 8 players to fire on Moto. There's also the old 2 ships passing in the night problem that was often said of Modern, where too many decks were built with a linear game plan that completely ignored interacting with the opponent, and whoever was faster or luckier won. For a more recent example of a bad format, and I'm just gonna say it even if it makes this video dated, Pioneer sucks right now. But first, before bashing it, let's look at the positives. Pioneer has a ton of deck diversity, with somewhere around 20 viable decks depending on how you count, including Rakdos Midrange, Nykthos Ramp, Rakdos Sack, Lotus Field, Blue-White Control, Greasefang, Spirits, Humans, Fires and Bring to Light decks, Phoenix, Creativity, Vehicles, Goblins and other red aggro decks, Neoform Atraxa, Boros Convoke, Rona Combo, Green-White Cocoa decks, Elves, Rogues, and Boggles. These decks also represent archetype diversity, including mid-range, control, aggro, ramp, combo, tempo, and value-based decks. However, the format suffers from many problems. It's too play draw dependent, often turning matches into a literal coin flip, or die roll. Many of the top decks have frustrating play patterns and are hard to interact with, such as Greasefang, Lotus Field, Nykthos, and Spirits. Matchups are too lopsided, with most decks having multiple other decks in the format that are atrocious for them to play against, such as Nykthos versus any aggro deck, or Rakdos versus the go-over-the-top value decks like Fires and Bring to Light. And lastly, there's a dearth of quality answers. Most removal and sideboard cards are either of poor quality, not up to the task of actually answering what they're supposed to, or just non-existent altogether. This leads to play patterns where many strategies are incredibly difficult to disrupt and decks just get run over. I think Aspiring Spikes recently said it best, and I'm paraphrasing, Pioneer is a format where players are akin to airplane pilots who went to pilot school, trained to be a pilot, acquired the knowledge and skills they would need to fly an aircraft, and when they finally get in the cockpit, they just engage the autopilot. So what can be done to improve Pioneer? Well, rather than just taking a ban hatchet to everything and killing off multiple decks, I think a better way would be to print quality answers into the format. Cards like Path to Exile, Monolith, and Lightning Bolt would go a long way towards improving the format and making obnoxious decks like Greasefang more tolerable. And with that, I wanted to talk about good and bad individual card designs, but I think the video has gone on long enough, so you'll have to wait until next week to hear my thoughts on why Blood Moon is the worst card ever printed, and why Burn is awful. That concludes the video, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you to my supporters, and if you enjoy these videos, consider subscribing or supporting the channel on Patreon, and take care.